Disarmament, Part 2. Knowing that there is no possibility of an inspection system to detect nuclear testing, knowing that the Soviets make a policy of not keeping promises, knowing that nuclear testing is necessary for research to develop a defense against enemy missiles, Eisenhower and Kennedy outlawed American nuclear testing for more than 4 years, giving the Soviets an unchallenged monopoly. American officialdom now says we cannot develop a defense against enemy missiles, although the Soviets may already have such a defense. And Kennedy drives ahead with plans to strip the United States of military defense. A defense against enemy missiles is the most desperately needed security weapon of this century, but there is proof that Kennedy does not want us to have such defense. That is a summary of my report on Disarmament, Part 2. The full message from my sponsor. If the United States had an effective defense against enemy missiles, communists could not blackmail us with threats of nuclear destruction. We could maintain a small, professional military establishment, as was once American tradition, and thus defend our nation without converting it into a police state through taxation and controls and compulsory peacetime conscription. But an effective anti-missile missile, the most desperately needed weapon in this century, is the weapon we do not have. Officialdom says that American prospects of developing such a weapon are virtually non-existent, but admits that the Soviets may be on the point of developing one if they do not already have it. American officialdom does not want the United States to have an effective defense against missiles. Evidence of this can be found in the State Department's disarmament plan, which stresses the outlawing of anti-missile weapons and the outlawing of research and testing intended to produce such weapons. Senator Strom Thurmond says the Defense Department has already made a decision to postpone the production of an anti-missile system until 1970, and the senator doubts that, under present policy, we will ever be permitted to develop such a system to protect our nation. Dr. Stephen Pussany of the Hoover Institute, who prepared a massive treatise on American disarmament schemes, says, quote, Mr. William C. Foster discloses the true attitude of the administration to anti-missile defense. They just don't want it. Foster, a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, is head of the Disarmament Agency. Extensive testing of nuclear weapons, especially in the atmosphere, is necessary for research to develop a defense against missiles. Yet, in the interest of negotiating with the Soviets, Eisenhower and Kennedy forfeited American security interests and for more than 4 years gave the Soviets unchallenged monopoly in the field of nuclear testing. This was done with full knowledge that there is no possibility of developing an inspection system to detect and identify illegal testing of nuclear weapons, even if the Soviets should agree to outlaw testing and should accept an international inspection system which we specified. Suppose that a ban on nuclear testing were in effect, with an international inspection system operating, and suppose the system detected nuclear explosion somewhere above the Pacific Ocean. At best, it would take several days for the system to correlate all data and determine the exact latitude and longitude of the explosion. By the time international inspectors reached the scene, what would they find? Nothing. Submarines which fired the tests would be gone. Communist propaganda would accuse the United States of making the shot. Our officials would make denials. There would be charges and countercharges in the United Nations. The wrangle would be protracted for weeks, while the Soviets prepared for another sneak shot somewhere over the Atlantic Ocean. Aware of all this, and aware also of the unassailable proof that it is folly to negotiate with the Soviets at all, because treaty breaking is a matter of policy and strategy with them, Eisenhower and Kennedy, during a critical period, prohibited the nuclear testing which might have developed a defensive weapon to save this country. The only official reason for the prohibition was that we must show good faith during negotiations with the Soviets. The facts make an amazing story. On March 31, 1958, the Soviet foreign minister announced that the Soviet Union was halting all testing of nuclear weapons, and he called upon other nations also to stop testing in the interest of peace and security for all peoples. Why? The Soviets had just finished a series of tests. It would take them a year or more to correlate and evaluate all information thus produced, and in the interim they could not profitably do any more testing. Trick designed to stop United States nuclear testing. Officials of the Eisenhower State Department did correctly call the Soviet plea a fraud, but challenged the Soviets to approach the subject in an orderly way through negotiations to work out a supervised system of nuclear testing. For years, the communist peace offensive had prepared for this moment. Organizations of nuclear scientists controlled by communist fronters and peace organizations composed of preachers, teachers, and professional liberals of all kinds had been drenching the American public with horror tales about the dangers of fallout from nuclear testing. The Soviet announcement on March 31, 1958, put these peace organizations into high gear. For 7 months, left-wing thunder for banning the bomb was deafening, until October 31, 1958, when the United States and the Soviet Union met for test ban talks and agreed to suspend all testing of nuclear weapons without inspections while the talks continued. Eisenhower ordered a halt to United States testing, accepting Khrushchev's unsupported promise that he would do likewise. Week after week, month after month, year after year, the test ban talks continued fruitlessly. The Soviets, busy assimilating information already produced by tests, did not need to make any nuclear shots in the atmosphere, but as the whole world was aware, they went right ahead with underground shots and any other testing they pleased, ignoring their agreement to halt all tests for the duration of the negotiations. Eisenhower kept the agreement, however, permitting no more American testing during the remainder of his administration. Dreary communiques from Geneva about another non-productive session of the test ban talks often seemed timed with sardonic humor to coincide with other events which underscored the absurdity of the talks. For example, in September 1959, reports from Geneva revealed that the test ban meetings between representatives of the West and East were deadlocked. Khrushchev was in the United States as an honored guest of Eisenhower at the time, and so Khrushchev spoke to the UN, saying the Soviets did not want just a little disarmament, they wanted total worldwide disarmament. And on that basis, disarmament discussions have been conducted ever since. In June 1960, the Soviets walked out of the test ban talks and stayed away for months. In September 1960, President Eisenhower spoke to the United Nations, pleading with the Soviets to come back for more talks. That set the stage nicely for the Soviets again. The day after Eisenhower made the plea, the Soviets again presented to the UN their plan for total worldwide disarmament. Throughout 1959 and 1960, there were grim warnings that the United States was gambling the very survival of our nation by refraining from nuclear testing while the Soviets were going right ahead with all the research and testing they pleased. But when Kennedy became president in 1961, he continued the ban on American nuclear testing, and he made many most significant appointments to key positions in his administration. Paul Nitze, Walt Rostow, E.A. Gullion, Jerome Wiesner, Charles Bolan, to mention only 5. All 5 are, of course, members of the Council on Foreign Relations. Paul Nitze, whom Kennedy made Assistant Secretary of Defense, was on record for wanting to turn the American Strategic Air Command over to NATO for eventual surrender to the United Nations. The Kennedy administration answered complaints about this by simply denying it. Walt Rostow and Charles Bolan produced Kennedy's first defense message to Congress, deliberately writing communist phraseology into it, de-emphasizing weapons which might give the United States capability of fighting an offensive war, de-emphasizing nuclear defense for the United States, but recommending a buildup of conventional forces which would enable the United States to participate in limited wars that could not possibly be any threat to the Soviet Union. This Kennedy defense program of 1961 was openly designed to please the Soviets and was presented to the Soviets at the same time Kennedy presented it to Congress. Jerome Wiesner, whom Kennedy made an absolute czar of all scientific planning and development within the administration, and set him up to operate behind a wall of White House secrecy that keeps even Congress from knowing what is going on, was on record as blaming the United States as much as the Soviet Union for the failure of disarmament talks with the Soviets. Early in the Kennedy administration, E.A. Gullion, whom Kennedy made an official in the Disarmament administration, held a briefing session in Washington, attended by leaders of influential left-wing tax-exempt organizations such as United World Federalists, Americans for Democratic Action, American Association for the United Nations, Walter Reuther's UAW-CIO, and so on. Gullion told these people to propagandize for a permanent disarmament agency that would be free of congressional control, free of the restraints imposed on government by our 18th century Constitution. And Congress complied. The propaganda was set up, and Congress in September 1961 passed the law authorizing the agency, and since 1961 the plans for the surrender of the United States have developed, as I will show next week. Goodbye, God bless you.